Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. James Whitmore, a New York billionaire with an icy charm, had always thought he controlled every aspect of his life. Between his businesses, his private jets, and his glamorous parties, there was no room for surprises, until tonight. Tonight, he was to accompany his new girlfriend, Emily Carter, to an event that should have been a mere vanity event, the wedding of his ex-wife, Victoria Langdon, to another influential man. James, determined to show he had moved on, thought everything would go smoothly. Emily, elegant and radiant in a midnight blue dress, had no idea how tense the atmosphere would be. From the moment they arrived, the air seemed thick with tension. Guests whispered as they passed, some stealing glances at James, others eyeing him with a hint of malevolent curiosity. Victoria, radiant in her ivory dress, fixed her gaze on him and gave him an enigmatic smile, a mixture of provocation and defiance. As James tried to relax with Emily, a series of unexpected revelations and confrontations shook the room, secrets from the past resurfaced, unexpected alliances were formed, and public humiliation seemed inevitable. And at the heart of it all, Emily, far from being sidelined, was about to show that she was not a mere spectator in the complex theater of New York high society. This wedding, which was supposed to be a simple social event, was going to turn into a battle of power, pride, and feelings, where everyone would discover that no one really controls the course of events, not even a billionaire. James Whitmore sat in his luxurious office on the 45th floor of a New York skyscraper, his fingers brushing against a stack of invitations. One caught his eye, the wedding of Victoria Langdon, his ex-wife. A mixture of nostalgia and resentment washed over him. "Are you going?" asked Emily, her voice soft but tinged with curiosity. James looked up from the invitation and contemplated it. Emily, his girlfriend of only a few months, knew nothing about Victoria or the past tensions. "Yes, but I don't want it to be complicated." He smiled, trying to hide his anxiety. Emily smiled back, but James felt his heart beat faster. He knew this wedding wouldn't be a mere social event. Memories of arguments, public humiliations, and Victoria's icy stares resurfaced. That evening, James and Emily arrived in a black limousine with tinted windows. The facade of the reception hall was illuminated, each light seeming to emphasize the grandeur of the moment and the contrast with the rising tension between them. The guests watched them as they arrived, some surprised, others smiling, but all aware of the past between James and Victoria. Victoria spotted them as soon as they entered. Her perfect, calculated smile froze James for a moment. Emily, sensing the tension, took his hand and whispered, "Whatever happens, I'm with you." And at that precise moment, James understood that this wedding would not just be a social event, but the beginning of an evening where nothing would go as planned. The reception was in full swing. Guests chatted, laughed, and sipped champagne while the band played upbeat tunes. James and Emily, hand in hand, were walking into the room when a murmur rippled through the crowd. Victoria approached, perfectly elegant, with her new husband at her side. Her eyes fixed on James, and her smile was both welcoming and provocative. "James, what a surprise to see you here," she said in a soft voice, but sharp as a razor. "Victoria, congratulations on your marriage," replied James, trying to remain polite. But the atmosphere grew tense. Some guests, familiar with their turbulent past, exchanged malicious glances. A cousin of Victoria's, unable to restrain her comments, murmured, "So this is him, the famous James Whitmore? They say he seduces all his women." Emily felt her stomach clench. James, for his part, refrained from responding coldly. He knew that any impulsive reaction would be exploited. But the evening was only just beginning. A few moments later, an old friend of Victoria's, Daniel Hargrove, approached James with an ambiguous smile. Always the same James, rich, elegant, but still with a complicated past, eh? James forced a smile, aware that every glance, every word could become a weapon. Emily, on the other hand, sensed that the evening would reveal more than just superficial tensions, secrets, jealousies, and repressed resentments. And when a waiter accidentally spilled a glass of champagne on Victoria's dress, James was wrongly accused by a malicious look. This small incident was the first domino to fall. The evening would turn into a series of unforeseen events, where every gesture would be observed, analyzed, and used. Emily then understood that this evening would be much more than just a wedding. It would be the scene of confrontations, revelations and, perhaps, plot twists that no one had anticipated. Dinner had just begun. The guests were seated around elegantly decorated tables, beneath sparkling chandeliers. James and Emily took their seats, but the atmosphere was electric. Every glance directed their way seemed laden with history and unspoken implications. Victoria, sitting nearby, kept staring at James. Her smile, always perfect, seemed to conceal an unseen intention. At one point, she raised her glass and whispered to her husband. "Look who's sitting there, the man who thought he'd forgotten me." Victoria's husband raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained neutral. Emily sensed the tension and understood that Victoria was trying to provoke James, to test his patience. She shook his hand under the table. "Ignore her. Show her you've changed." But James knew it wouldn't be easy. Victoria then gave a glacial look to a guest, who laughed nervously, before whispering loud enough for James to hear. "It seems James has never really moved on." James' heart sank, but he remained calm. He leaned towards Emily and whispered, "Stay close to me. Anything can happen tonight." A few minutes later, an incident occurred. A waiter tripped and dropped a tray of hors d'oeuvres right next to Victoria. Shards of food and champagne scattered across the tablecloth. Victoria's eyes fixed on James with surprising intensity, as if she were accusing him of the disaster. The tension in the room rose instantly. Emily, indignant, stood up to intervene, but James held her back. "Leave it. It's a trap, don't fall into it." It was at that precise moment that James realized that this evening would not simply be a social dinner, it would be a battleground of glances, manipulations and provocations, where every gesture could change the course of events. And Emily, although inexperienced in this world of high society, began to understand that she too would have to fight, but with very different weapons. The background music had softened, giving way to whispers and stifled laughter. James and Emily thought they could breathe for a moment, but Victoria had other plans. As the couple crossed the room to join their friends, Victoria suddenly stood up and spoke, in a clear and perfectly calculated voice. "Dear guests, I think it's worth remembering that some familiar faces have a complex history with me." An icy silence fell. All eyes turned to James. He felt his muscles tense as Emily squeezed his hand tightly. Victoria continued, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "James Whitmore, a charming man, certainly, but whose romantic past is, let's say, colorful." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some guests burst out laughing, while others whispered amongst themselves. James felt anger rising, but he kept his composure. Emily, shocked, immediately understood that Victoria was not simply trying to remind everyone of their history, she wanted to humiliate James in front of all their guests, rewrite his past in her own way, and prove that she still had power over him. "This is not the time," James murmured to Emily, clenching his jaw. But Victoria wasn't finished. She made a theatrical gesture towards James. "I hope your success today matches your past behavior." The murmur in the room became a hubbub. James felt his face heat up, but he took a deep breath and turned to Emily. "No matter what she says, tonight is our night, not hers." Emily nodded, but inside she knew the battle was only just beginning. Victoria had opened Pandora's box, and now all eyes and judgments were on her and James. This wedding, intended as a simple social event, had just turned into a scene of public confrontation, where every smile and every word would be scrutinized and analyzed, and where the real war was only just beginning. After the public humiliation orchestrated by Victoria, James withdrew with Emily to the bar, where the lamplight created a more intimate atmosphere. Emily sensed James's anger, but she knew that any impulsive reaction would only benefit Victoria. "Let me handle this," Emily murmured, her voice calm but determined. James looked at her, surprised. Emily, you've never been in this world. You don't understand. Maybe not, she replied, but I know I can change the game. Without wasting any time, Emily began interacting with the influential guests around them. With charm and confidence, she engaged in subtle conversations, planting questions about Victoria's past and the alliances within the room. Every word was carefully chosen to sow doubt, forge connections, and demonstrate her own strength without provoking direct confrontation. Victoria, sitting nearby, quickly noticed the strategy. Her smile froze slightly when she saw Emily laugh and captivate the attention of several powerful guests, including some who had long supported Victoria. James felt a mixture of pride and admiration. Emily wasn't just beautiful, she was intelligent, cunning, and knew how to play her cards in this high society game. Then came a decisive moment. A former business partner of Victoria's, who until then had remained silent, approached James and Emily. With an enigmatic smile, he whispered to James. Emily has something Victoria never had, and it shows. Victoria, hearing these words, felt her control waver. It was the first sign that the evening could take a completely different turn, and that James was no longer the only player in this room. Emily had just become his best weapon. As the music resumed and the reception continued, a new tension arose. This time, the confrontation was no longer open, but subtle, strategic, and much more dangerous. As the evening progressed, the conversations and laughter barely masked the underlying tensions. Emily had found her place, but James sensed that the moment of truth was approaching. Suddenly, an old friend of Victoria's, Marcus Langford, stepped towards James with an ambiguous smile. "James, do you remember that night in Manhattan 5 years ago?" he said, hinting at an uncomfortable secret. James felt a wave of unease. He had always hoped that certain episodes from his past would remain buried. But Marcus, smiling deliberately, seemed ready to reveal everything. Intrigued, Victoria immediately got up and walked towards them, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Oh, you're talking about that famous incident," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "I wonder if everyone here really knows the truth." The murmur in the room intensified. The guests began to turn towards them, curious to know this mysterious secret. James felt the weight of public attention and knew he had to act with caution. Emily, seeing the rising tension, subtly positioned herself next to James. "No matter what you say, we know the truth," she murmured. "And that's all that matters." But Victoria wasn't ready to give up. She shot Emily a glacial look. "That's adorable, you think you can protect James with your little schemes. But some things can't stay hidden." At that moment, James understood that the evening had changed dimension. It was no longer just a social confrontation, but a struggle for control of information, where every secret could become a weapon, and where Emily had just become an indispensable shield. The tone had just risen a notch, and the shadow of past revelations now hung over the entire reception, ready to explode at any moment. The room was now filled with palpable tension. Every guest held their breath, waiting for the next move to erupt like fireworks. James felt his shoulders tense, aware that the past he thought he had under control was about to be revealed. Marcus Langford, Victoria's old friend, stepped to the center of the room with a theatrical air. He raised his voice so that everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that some memories deserve to be shared." James Whitmore was not only a brilliant businessman, but also someone who was deeply betrayed by those he trusted. Murmurs rippled through the room, and Victoria frowned. James, unperturbed, kept his eyes fixed on Emily, who returned his reassuring gaze. Marcus continued, casting an almost accusatory glance at Victoria. "And it seems that certain truths concerning Victoria Langdon have been carefully concealed. Perhaps this marriage is not as perfect as it appears." The shock was immediate. The guests began to whisper, and some turned towards Victoria, whose smile was beginning to waver. She tried to regain her composure. "What do you mean by that?" she said, trying to hide her nervousness behind a calm voice. "It's simply that everyone deserves to know what really happened," Marcus replied, placing a file on the central table. The photos, letters, and messages projected onto a screen behind him left the room speechless. Emily felt James trembling, but she knew it was time to act. She gently took James's hand and, in a firm but calm voice, said, "The truth has never needed hiding places. Everyone can now see who is truly trustworthy." Victoria, shaken by the explosion of revelations, retreated, unable to maintain her composure. The murmurs turned into exclamations, and James, with Emily at his side, realized that this evening, which he had feared, had just turned in his favor. But he knew the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The consequences of these revelations would transform the rest of the evening, and perhaps their entire lives. After the explosive revelation, the room was in an uproar. The guests whispered amongst themselves, some shocked, others fascinated by the truths revealed. Victoria, once in control of the situation, suddenly found herself in the spotlight of humiliation. How dare you?" she murmured, her hands trembling, addressing Marcus and James at the same time. James, remaining calm, simply replied, "I'm simply letting the truth speak for itself." Emily, still by his side, added confidently, "And sometimes, the truth is more powerful than all smiles and appearances." Victoria felt panic rising within her. The guests, who once admired her for her charm and influence, were now beginning to whisper about her arrogance and manipulation. Even her new husband, usually stoic, exchanged a worried glance with her, clearly disturbed by the magnitude of the revelations. In an attempt to salvage her reputation, Victoria stood up and tried to deliver an impromptu speech. But her words were interrupted by mocking laughter from a group of guests. "Ah, so this is the great Victoria," one of them exclaimed. "She seems to be just human after all." Humiliated, Victoria retreated, unable to find a way out. James, seeing her vulnerability, didn't rejoice in her downfall. On the contrary, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Their past had been complicated, but seeing Victoria like this, out of control, was painful in its own way. Emily, taking James' hand, whispered, "We held firm together." James nodded. The evening, which he had dreaded, had turned in their favor. But he knew that the hardest part was yet to come, managing the social, professional, and personal consequences of this explosion of truth. And as Victoria left the room, under the curious and sometimes cruel gazes of the guests, James realized that this night had changed something fundamental. Nothing would ever be the same again, neither for him nor for Emily. After Victoria's humiliating departure, the reception returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the atmosphere had changed forever. The guests now mingled with James and Emily, some curious, others admiring. James, with a slight smile, took Emily by the hand and said, "Did you see? Everyone looks at us differently now." Emily smiled back, aware that their duo had just transformed into an undeniable force. She replied, "It's not just how others see us, it's how we see ourselves too. We now know that we can face anything together." Conversations around them had subtly shifted. Alliances that were once invisible were beginning to form, with some guests seeing Emily and James as a solid couple, capable of navigating the turbulent waters of high society. However, the evening's victory did not mean the end of the challenges. Marcus Langford, ever discreet but attentive, approached James to whisper to him, "The truth has won tonight, but you know as well as I do that some people will never get over this humiliation." James nodded, aware that their rise to power came with its own dangers. Emily, true to her intuition, added, "As long as we remain united, we can overcome anything that comes our way." Later that evening, James and Emily retired to the balcony. The view of the illuminated New York skyline offered a moment of respite from the intrigues and whispers of the reception. James took a deep breath and murmured, "This wedding was supposed to be a nightmare, but in the end, it showed us who we really are." Emily rested her head on his shoulder and replied gently, "And this is just the beginning." As the lights in the room gradually dimmed and the guests began to leave, James and Emily realized that this evening had marked a turning point. A new balance had been established, but high society, with its power games and secrets, continued to exist, ready to test their strength at any moment. The night was drawing to a close. The reception had ended, leaving behind an almost unreal silence. The guests had left, each taking their impressions, judgments, and secrets with them. James and Emily stood on the balcony, overlooking the city that shimmered under the night lights. This evening, initially dreaded, had shattered all their expectations. Victoria had left the room humiliated, unable to regain her authority or her untarnished reputation. "You were incredible tonight, Emily," James said, looking at her admiringly. "Without you, I never would have been able to keep my cool and turn the situation to our advantage." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with pride and complicity. "We are a team. And what we went through tonight was just a glimpse of what we can accomplish together." James nodded. He understood that the real victory was not just overcoming Victoria or regaining social control, it was finding someone who shared his values, his strength, and his intelligence. A few moments later, an unexpected message arrived on James's phone. It was confirmation: certain alliances with influential partners, whom Victoria thought she controlled, were now in their favor. High society had just acknowledged their power. Emily, seeing his smile, whispered, "So, everything is finally ours." James took her in his arms, and together they gazed at the sleeping city, knowing that this night had marked the beginning of a new era. Victoria, despite all her efforts, had lost her position, while James and Emily had not only survived, but had become stronger and more united than ever. The marriage, which had seemed like an unexpected obstacle, had transformed into a lesson in resilience, strategy, and partnership. And as dawn approached, James and Emily understood that this was only the beginning of even greater adventures, together.